There is a list that keeps resurfacing in genealogy circles across the Mediterranean. 13 surnames. Passed down through families in Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, southern Spain, and the coastal towns of Tunisia. Families who were told, generation after generation, that their name did not begin with Rome. It began before Rome. It began with Carthage. For centuries this was treated as folklore. A colorful family story, the kind every culture keeps somewhere in its attic. Then geneticists started looking at the actual DNA of Mediterranean populations, and something strange happened. The story did not disappear. It got more complicated. And in some places, it got more convincing. This is not a story about proving that 13 specific families are the last heirs of Hannibal. No serious scientist would claim that, and neither will we. But it is a story about what happens when you take an empire that history books insist was erased, and you go looking for it anyway. Not in ruins, not in inscriptions, but in the genome. What researchers found does not confirm the old family legends exactly as they were told. It does something more unsettling. It suggests the legends may have been pointing, however imperfectly, at something real. For most of Western history, Carthage exists as a footnote to Rome's victory. Founded, according to tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre around the 9th century BCE, Carthage grew into the dominant maritime power of the Western Mediterranean. It built a trading network that stretched from the coast of modern Lebanon to the Strait of Gibraltar and beyond. Its general, Hannibal Barca, marched elephants across the Alps and came within reach of destroying Rome itself. And then, in 146 BCE, after 3 brutal wars, Rome finished what it started. Carthage was burned. Its population was killed, enslaved, or scattered. Roman writers claimed the fields were sown with salt so nothing would grow there again, almost certainly a later embellishment, but one that captures how total the Roman victory was meant to feel. The accepted story, the one taught for generations, goes like this. Carthage fell, its people were absorbed or destroyed, its language died out within a few centuries, and its civilization survives only as ruins beneath a Roman city, beneath a French colonial suburb, beneath modern Tunis. A great power, Rome wrote the history, and Rome had every reason to make the erasure sound complete. But erasure is a strange thing to prove. Cities can be burned. Languages can fade. People are harder to delete. The first crack in the tidy narrative did not come from a laboratory. It came from linguists and local historians who noticed that Punic, the language of Carthage, did not vanish as quickly as Rome's own writers implied. Inscriptions in Punic and its later form, Neo-Punic, continued to appear in North Africa for centuries after the city's destruction. Saint Augustine, writing in the 4th century CE, more than 500 years after Carthage fell, mentioned that Punic was still spoken in the North African countryside of his own time. That is a strange kind of death for a civilization. A city can burn in an afternoon. A language spoken by rural communities for 5 centuries afterwards suggests something Rome's propaganda did not want to admit. The people did not go anywhere. Only the empire did. That was the first anomaly. Not a genetic one, not yet, a cultural one. If the language persisted, if farming communities across Tunisia, eastern Algeria, and pockets of Sicily kept speaking a dialect of the dead city long after its walls fell, then the population itself likely persisted too. History had recorded a military collapse and mistaken it for a human one. This is where genetics enters the story, and where the investigation becomes something closer to archaeology of the body rather than the ground. Human DNA carries several kinds of evidence, and each tells a slightly different story. Mitochondrial DNA passes almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, giving researchers a way to trace maternal lineages deep into the past. The Y chromosome does something similar along the paternal line, passed from father to son. And autosomal DNA, the broad mixture inherited from both parents, gives a wider picture of a population's overall ancestry, layered and blended across centuries of intermarriage, migration, and contact. When researchers began sampling populations along the old Phoenician and Punic trade routes, coastal Tunisia, western Sicily, Malta, Sardinia, parts of southern Spain and the Balearic Islands, They were not initially hunting for Carthage specifically. They were mapping the deeper genetic history of the Mediterranean, trying to understand how thousands of years of trade, colonization, and conquest had shaped the people living there today. Carthage, if it appeared at all, was expected to be background noise. A minor smudge beneath layers of Roman, Arab, Byzantine, Norman, and Ottoman influence. That is not entirely what they found. One of the more widely discussed projects, sometimes referred to informally in the press as the Phoenician gene study, analyzed Y chromosome markers in men across former Phoenician and Punic colonial sites around the Mediterranean. The researchers were cautious in their conclusions, as good scientists tend to be. They did not claim to have found Carthaginian DNA in any pure or dramatic sense. No such thing exists, because Carthage itself was never genetically uniform. It was a trading empire built on mixture. Phoenician settlers marrying into North African Berber populations, Sicilian and Sardinian communities, Iberian traders, and likely descendants of even older Mediterranean populations that predate all of them. What the researchers found instead was a shared genetic signature, a set of paternal lineage markers, appearing at elevated frequencies in populations living near ancient Phoenician and Punic port sites, compared to inland populations in the same regions with no such trading history. That was not a confirmation of the family legends. It was something stranger. It was a signal. If you wanted a single, dramatic explanation, it would be tempting to say the DNA proves those 13 surnames belong to unbroken bloodlines stretching back to Carthage itself. Geneticists are more careful than that, and so should we be. Surnames, especially in the Mediterranean, are relatively recent inventions. Most families did not adopt fixed hereditary names until the medieval or even early modern period. A surname cannot travel back 2,000 years on its own. What can travel back that far is population-level ancestry, the deep genetic inheritance of a region, carried forward not through a name but through unbroken generations of people who never entirely left. So here is where the investigation opens into real possibility rather than closing into a simple answer. There are at least 3 explanations researchers have weighed, and none of them cancels the others out. The first is straightforward regional continuity. Coastal communities in Tunisia, western Sicily, and parts of Sardinia may simply be descended, in significant part, from populations that were already living in and around Punic settlements before Rome's conquest. Populations that never disappeared, only changed rulers, languages, and eventually religions, while remaining rooted in the same towns for 2,000 years. The second is admixture through trade rather than conquest. Phoenician and Punic merchants established colonies and intermarried with local populations across the western Mediterranean for over 5 centuries before Carthage even fell. That means the genetic legacy of Carthage was already spreading outward, mixing into Sicilian, Sardinian, and Iberian populations, long before Rome ever destroyed the city itself. In this view, Carthaginian ancestry was never concentrated in one bloodline waiting to be preserved. It was already diffused across the Mediterranean centuries earlier, like ink released into water. The third possibility is the one that unsettles the tidy narrative most. Some researchers have proposed that what looks like a distinctly Phoenician or Punic genetic signature may actually reflect a much older layer of Mediterranean and Near Eastern population movement, one that predates Phoenician colonization altogether, and that the Phoenicians themselves carried rather than originated. If that is true, then some of what modern studies detect is not the fingerprint of Carthage specifically, but of a deeper, older human migration that Carthage was simply one chapter within. This does not disprove a Punic legacy. It complicates the question of where that legacy actually begins. If you find that interesting, the idea that a single family story can lead into layers of migration going back thousands of years, this is the kind of investigation worth following. Subscribing helps, because there is a great deal more hidden in the human past than most family trees ever admit. The landmark moment in this field came not from a single study but from the growing use of ancient DNA, genetic material extracted directly from burial sites, rather than inferred only from living populations. Excavations at Punic-era cemeteries in Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa have allowed researchers to compare ancient genomes directly against modern Mediterranean populations, rather than reconstructing the past purely through modern sampling and statistical modeling. This is a meaningfully different kind of evidence. Modern DNA can only hint backward. Ancient DNA lets researchers stand, genetically, inside the population itself, at the moment Carthage still existed. What the ancient samples revealed was not a single, unified, Carthaginian genome. It was something closer to a mosaic, genetic contributions from the Levant, from indigenous North African populations, from early Sicilian and Sardinian communities, woven together over centuries of Punic maritime expansion. In other words, Carthage was never one people. It was already, at the height of its power, a layered, blended, multi-ancestral civilization, closer in genetic structure to a modern port city than to the ethnically uniform empire later imagined by both its enemies and its romanticizers. And this is the twist that most surprised researchers, and most surprises audiences hearing about it for the first time. The genetic legacy most strongly associated with ancient Punic sites was not, in many cases, most concentrated among families who proudly claim Carthaginian surnames today. It appeared, often more strongly, in populations who never told that story about themselves at all, rural communities in inland Sicily, small farming towns in Sardinia, Berber-descended populations in Tunisia who traced their identity through entirely different oral traditions. The ancestry did not follow the legend. It moved quietly through populations who never thought to claim it, while surfacing only faintly, sometimes not at all, in some of the families who built entire identities around the Carthaginian name. That is not a failure of the family stories. It may be something closer to the opposite. It suggests that the memory of Carthage did not survive because a handful of elite lineages preserved it carefully across 2,000 years. It survived, if it survived at all, the way most deep history survives: diffused, mixed, half-forgotten, carried unknowingly by ordinary people who never wrote it down, rather than guarded consciously by the families who did. This changes what the 13 surnames question is really asking. It was never really about proving 13 bloodlines. It became a test case for a much larger truth, that the fall of an empire is rarely the disappearance of a people. Rome could destroy Carthage's walls, its fleet, its political independence, and its name on a map. It could not destroy the millions of individual human beings who had lived, worked, farmed, and intermarried across its territory for 500 years before the final war ever began. Their descendants did not vanish. They simply stopped being called Carthaginian and started being called something else: Roman provincials, then Byzantine subjects, then Arab-influenced North Africans, then modern Tunisians, Sicilians, Sardinians, Maltese. The name changed 7 or 8 times. The people, in large part, stayed. Picture the coastline near ancient Utica, north of what is now Tunis, where the low hills meet the Mediterranean in long golden light. Fishing boats still leave from harbors that Phoenician sailors mapped nearly 3,000 years ago. Somewhere beneath the modern roads and olive groves, the foundations of Punic warehouses and temples still sit in the earth, mostly unexcavated, patient. The wind off the water is the same wind that filled Carthaginian sails on their way to Sicily, to Sardinia, to Spain. It is easy, standing there, to feel that history is a straight line running from that harbor into oblivion. The genetic evidence suggests something closer to a river, one that went underground, resurfaced under different names in different countries, speaking different languages, but never entirely stopped flowing. None of this offers the clean, dramatic certainty that a headline promising 13 Carthaginian surnames seems to promise. Genetics rarely offers that kind of certainty, and any documentary that claims otherwise is selling something simpler than the truth. What the evidence does offer is more interesting than a verified bloodline. It offers a correction to the assumption that empires die completely, and that history's losers disappear from the human record the moment their cities burn. If there is a lesson in the DNA of the Western Mediterranean, it is this: identity was never as neatly inherited as a surname implies. The people who might, in some diffuse and unprovable way, carry a thread of Carthage in their genome are not necessarily the ones who kept the name. They are, more often, the ones who kept living quietly, anonymously, across 2,000 years of conquest, conversion, and reinvention, in the same hills, along the same coastlines, farming the same soil their ancestors farmed when Hannibal was still a living man and not yet a legend. The empire fell. Rome made sure the world believed it fell completely. But complete erasure turns out to be one of history's hardest claims to prove, and one of the easiest for a genome to quietly contradict. Carthage did not survive in a name, or a flag, or 13 tidy family trees passed down like heirlooms. It survived the way most of deep human history survives, scattered, mixed, imperfectly remembered, and written, whether we knew it or not, into the DNA of people who never stopped calling that coastline home. If stories like this interest you, where a single family legend unravels into thousands of years of migration, conquest, and quiet survival, subscribe, because the human past holds far more of these hidden threads than most of us ever learn to look for.